awake me from my dream. Mother, awake me in thy love. Hand in hand we're dancing together in the high light. When I awake, I'll end all fear. When I awake, I will know thy love. Hello friends, Nayaswami Hriman here on our noontime broadcast of the unpublished writings of Paramhansa Yogananda. I'd like to share with you today from the Super Advanced Course Number 1, Lesson 9, Unique, Concrete, Psychological Machines, or Inner Devices, for Conquering Fear, Anger, Greed, Temptation, Failure Consciousness, and Inferiority Complexes. Now, technically, I can't say this is unpublished because I got this copy on Amazon.com. So somebody has made sure these old lessons are now in the public domain and have published them. But I'm going to share with you anyway. And today I'd like to share with you the first one that he wrote in this Lesson 9 called Conquering Fear. I recall that as a young man, I remember thinking to myself that I didn't have any fears. Well, I later realized as the years rolled on that was only because I wasn't all that self-aware. You know, sometimes you say, well, I'm not interested in doing this, or I'm not interested in going there, but you don't really question why. You're just so addicted to your likes and dislikes that you never even bother to consider why I don't want to do this. Well, maybe because there's an element of fear around not wanting to go somewhere or to do something. Now that I'm 71 years old, this body anyway, I realize that most people have lots of fears. The borderline between a fear and a simple disinclination might be a little gray in some cases, but on the other hand, more extreme forms of fear are also quite common. So, of course, the main antidote for fear is, as Yogananda indicates in this lesson, courage. And he says, and I applied this thought to other things such as guilt, that fear and guilt are there to stimulate our response to the threat or the situation that requires our attention. And so we can be frozen and paralyzed by fear or guilt. I don't want to talk about guilt today, so I'll drop that subject now. But on the other hand, fear can stimulate us to respond courageously, in any case effectively, towards the item that we fear. I have never been in this lifetime on a battlefield, but I have read that people in crises, including the now famous 9/11 crisis where the Twin Towers were destroyed, that it's not so much that people who respond to crises, situation, or battlefields don't feel fear. It's a question of how they respond to it. In fact, if you were on a battlefield and felt no fear at all, you very likely could do something foolish that would cost your life. A certain amount of fear, in other words, acts as a stimulant. And so let us not fear, but fear itself, as Winston Churchill once said so famously now. So Yogananda starts off with a fairly obvious statement, one we've all concluded on our own. He says, when fear overpowers you, realize that the worst that can happen is you can die. Well, that is very likely the one thing you do fear. So that's not very reassuring to most people. But nonetheless, that thought does come. What's the worst that can happen? It's called worst case scenario response. So when you have a fear, and not all fear is based on the fear of dying, obviously. We have fear of public speaking or any number of things that can happen. So if you have a certain amount of rationality in your makeup, if you go somewhat by reason and the intellect, you can perhaps use the technique of asking yourself, well, gee whiz, what's the worst that can happen? Then imagine that worst and see yourself getting over it and see yourself dealing with it, okay? So worst case scenario thought experiments is a good way. Oh, here comes my favorite garbage truck. Well, I closed the window so he wouldn't disturb you so much, or me. Any case, he always comes at noontime. Oh, he's going to get my garbage can. Good fellow. Okay, so worst case scenario imagination thought experiment, to coin Einstein's famous phrase, is a very healthy technique unless your emotions are so whipped up and worked up, or you go more by emotion, then the worst case scenario planning isn't all that effective for you. Anyway, Yogananda goes on, and in speaking of death, he says, death is not a tyrant, but a deliverer. I found this thought one I hadn't ever gotten so far as to conclude. He says, death releases us from physical pain and mental suffering. Death is the physical, mental, and spiritual anodyne. I don't really know what anodyne means, which brings relief from all anguish for a period immediately following mortal life. Well, again, that's not going to help you if you're just trembling with fear. He also posits or acknowledges the very common situation. He says, do not fear accidents and disease because you have recently experienced these things, because such fear sort of lying upon your heart, or the residue of your experiences, let's say with a car accident, it's very common for someone in a car accident to be hesitant to drive again. I've had a few car accidents when I was young, not all my fault logically, but I seem to recall, I don't know how or when, a memory of feeling a little bit, not tremulous, but not even fearful, but hesitant after an accident to drive again. Didn't last very long because I'm a fairly courageous driver as such things go, fairly relaxed driver and alert, even at my advanced age. But I have a memory of that response, and so I know that is also quite common. You get into a serious car accident, and it can be a while before you feel confident driving again. Well, be that as it may, that's the other thing. I remember my mother-in-law, God bless her, she's gone now, rest her soul, but she had a fear, like many people, of flying, or others a fear of heights. Well, no amount of logic is going to shake that feeling that comes over you when the airplane lifts off, or you approach a high, some place where you look over the edge or something. It just sort of envelops you, and you can't do a lot about that. Logic, as I say, doesn't much. But you should know that to the extent you indulge in those post-mortem fears, I just coined that phrase, you water the seeds of that fear, and if you continue in that vein, you will attract more opportunities to get over that fear. So get over it. Okay. On the other hand, fearlessness will in all probability, he writes, avert them and minimize their power over you for the future. Obviously, mental indulgence, as he writes, creates a subconscious fear habit. And, so remember, he says, no matter how great your trials may be, you are able to conquer them. Now, here's the next sentence is something you hear all the time, but it's nice to hear it from such a one as Paramhansa Yogananda. He says, God will not suffer you to be tempted and tried beyond your strength. That's probably the greatest thing that he has written here. God will not tempt you beyond your strength to cope. Hold on to that, okay? Whatever it is that envelops you in fear, know that that's an opportunity to express courage, to express willpower, to express faith, to express hope. You see, isn't that wonderful? So, when fear comes, then he gives this more practical technique. Tense and relax the body several times. Inhale and tense, vibrating the body with energy. Exhale, relax, and feel. So when fear comes, use this technique repeatedly. Switch on the currents of calmness and serenity. Let your whole mental machinery he was really tuning into the consciousness of the 1920s and 30s. Let your whole mental machinery awaken and actively hum, 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 with the vibration of willpower to do something in response to your fears. Then harness the power of will to the cogwheels of fearless caution and continuous good judgment, which in turn must constantly resolve and produce mental devices for escaping your specific impending calamity. He seems to use this idea of devices and machinery, which is a sort of a chuckle for me. I don't think of myself as a machine, but that was a very common, and for many people continues to be, the view of the body, the view of a lot of doctors, surgeons. It's just a machine, and you fix a part, you take this one out and put it in another one, and all that sort of thing. But it's very interesting, the concept of applying your will. Now he says fearless caution. What is fearless caution? I don't really know. I guess it's to be cautioned fearlessly, and continuous good judgment. Well, both of those stem most purely from calm intuition. That much I do know. Okay? I think of reports after 9/11, but these reports also came out of other studies of war and so on, crises of one sort or another. There are some people who respond, they just freeze up. The deer in the headlights is that phrase. Other people, even if they feel fear, have some kind of a sense of judgment and, where the escape hatch is, or the fire escape, or whatever it is. Just, I think of people who, when they enter a room filled with people, they examine where the exits are, like what they tell you on the airplane. Pay attention. Those are the kind of people who look around their circumstances, their surroundings, or at the workplace, observe, how people behave and how they speak, and take notice of things in order to, not to judge, but in order to be prepared to act effectively to those circumstances. Okay, use fear as a stimulus to accelerate your inner machine of consciousness, to produce some mental devices. Here's he says something interesting here. He says these mental devices to escape fear are so numerous that they have to be specially fashioned by the almighty tool of consciousness, according to the specific and extraordinary needs of an individual. I don't know if that's just his way of not giving a lot of specifics. I don't think that would be fair for me to say of him. After all, this is a general lesson. But I think he's saying that fears are so numerous and circumstances so complex or differentiated that there's no pat one remedy to such things. It's your willpower, your courage, your interest in taking action that becomes the channel for the inspiration and the ideas which just sort of appear instantly. Okay. Fear should spur you on to calm, cautious activity, avoiding equally rashness and timidity. Do you see the middle path? Avoid rashness and timidity. Okay. Fear of failure or sickness is nourished by thinking constantly of all kinds of dire possibilities until they take root in the subconsciousness. And this is interesting. And finally, in the superconscious. Isn't that interesting? And I think what is intended by the idea that fears can take root in the superconsciousness is how they take root in order to actually manifest. It's by the power of the superconscious that you draw those fears into manifestation. All right, well, I need to shut it down here. Another remedy he gives is in respect to the nature of your fear, let's say fear of ill health, let's say, or a lot of people as I get older are fearful of retirement because they don't know how they're going to afford to live. Associate with healthy or prosperous people who do not fear sickness or failure. So satsang, associate with people who have the good karma, the bad karma for which you are in fear. Okay. If necessary and faced with fear, divert your mind by turning your attention to interesting, absorbing books or even to harmless amusements. You've got to cauterize the mind from obsessing on fear. Fear aggravates our miseries, intensifies 100-fold our pain and mental agony. It contaminates vivid imagination, emotions, and paralyzes our willing efforts. It develops in an individual a malignant magnetism. Fear is poison to the body and the mind. Okay, it destroys initiative. It has a deleterious effect on the heart, nervous system, and brain, destructive to initiative, courage, judgment, common sense, and willpower. It throws a veil over intuition. Kill fear by refusing to be afraid of it. And this is where he concludes by turn your attention to God for eternal safety. Even though death knocks at your door or you are rocked on the seas of suffering, God's protecting rays can dispel the menacing clouds of doomsday, calm the waves of trials, and keep you safe, whether you are in a castle or on a battlefield. He closes by saying, even if you were disgustingly wealthy, disgustingly healthy, you never know. In a day, all of that can be gone. And so learn that your true source of courage, protection, inspiration comes from the superconscious mind, from the soul. I am ever with you. Okay.